I'm back. After working overtime until 8 p.m., I opened the door to see Jiangwan sitting in my seat at the dining table, realizing that my good mood for the day was about to come to an end. You're back, sis? I just finished eating. Here, take my seat, Jiangwan said as she got up from my little duck feather cushion, inviting me over as if she were the host. My parents acted as if they didn't even see me, only focusing on making polite conversation with Jiangwan. Wan, it's so late. Why don't you just stay over? No need, my mom's still waiting for me. Jiangwan replied, shaking the lunchbox in her hand as she put on her coat and left. I glanced at the table. The bowl that was supposed to hold my favorite steamed pork was polished clean, not a piece of meat left. I had been starving, but the moment I saw Jiangwan, my appetite vanished. As soon as the door closed, my seemingly kind and gentle parents instantly drooped their heads, silently eating their white rice. I took off my coat and was about to go to my room to check what had gone missing when my mom suddenly looked up from her bowl and sighed, "Cece, your aunt has found you another match." I paused for a moment, then collapsed face first onto my bed. My aunt's name is Zhang Chuxue. She's my mom's only sister, and her daughter, my cousin, is the lovely lady who just left with both the food and the leftovers. Ever since I can remember, Zhang Chuxue and Jiangwan have come to our house every so often to visit, and while they're at it, they take my mom's jewelry, clothes, and small furniture. Sometimes, when my mom is reluctant to part with something, Zhang Chuxue would sarcastically say, "Oh, sister, you're so lucky. You're educated, married to a policeman. If only I had been a bit luckier back then, maybe I could have lived a fairy tale life like you." As soon as Zhang Chuxue says this, my mom would immediately bend over and lower her head, letting the mother and daughter take everything from the house without ever looking up again. With Zhang Chuxue setting such a fine example, Jiangwan doesn't hold back either. Growing up, the dynamic between Jiangwan and me has always been the same. If I liked something, she would want it, and if I wanted something, she would try to take it. When we had identical lunch boxes, she'd snatch mine as soon as we were out the door, dumping all the ham and veggies I loved into hers. If I resisted, she'd smack the lunch box out of my hands, leaving me without even plain rice to eat. If a friend gave me a hair clip, she'd yank it out of my hair without a word and put it on hers. If I chased her, she'd throw it into the water while crying and run to her mom to complain. When I got a new bicycle, she'd be the first to tear off the plastic wrap and hop on, riding at full speed. Going downhill, she'd let go of the handlebars, sending the bike crashing into a wall, leaving it in pieces. With just a small scrape on her arm, she'd cry louder than thunder, scaring my parents into rushing her to the hospital and getting scolded by her mom along the way. But that was all in the past. As we grew up, I realized that Jiangwan had set her sights higher. Instead of stealing my things, she seemed more interested in stealing people from me. My first love was in high school. The summer we graduated, he came to my house to help fix the fridge. I went out to buy a screwdriver, and when I returned, I found them half-dressed, rolling around on my sofa. Jiangwan said, "Sis, we're truly in love. Please give us your blessing." My second boyfriend was from college. The night before I was going to introduce him to my parents, I saw them together at a hotel entrance. I followed them upstairs and caught them in bed. Jiangwan said, "Sis, this man isn't right for you." The last one was my former boss. On our third date, we ran into Jiangwan. As usual, sparks flew between them right in front of me, their eyes practically glued to each other. Jiangwan said, "Sis, office romances are a bad idea." To be fair, Jiangwan wasn't exactly on par with me. Aside from having a better figure, her features weren't as pretty as mine, her charm wasn't as good, her knowledge wasn't as deep, and she was even a jinx to men. My first love was dumped by her after 8 months. He got drunk, caused trouble, and was expelled from school. Later, he married a rural woman his parents picked out for him. But he never forgot that he was Jiangwan's first man, secretly sending her money and caring for her, until one day it was discovered, and he ended up divorced, drinking his days away. My second boyfriend was luckier. He broke up with Jiangwan after 6 months. On his 18th attempt to win her back, he fell down the stairs and was laid up for 7 months. My last boyfriend dated Jiang Wan for 3 months. During those 3 short months, he used his connections to fake a diploma and get her a job at our company. A week ago, Jiang Wan reported him for bribery, and he was blacklisted by the company. So, from Jiang Wan's perspective, she believes she's always been helping me by getting rid of the bad ones. When it came to stealing things, Zhang Chuxue taught Jiang Wan the basics, and they each operated independently. But when it came to stealing people, Zhang Chuxue and Jiang Wan worked together seamlessly, like a well-oiled machine. Usually, after Jiang Wan sacrificed herself to help me identify another scumbag, Zhang Chuxue would enthusiastically introduce me to a new prospect, perhaps a bald, blind, and half-lame man, or a 38-year-old penniless farmer demanding a dowry of 100,000 yuan, or maybe a coal boss worth over $1 million, fresh from beating his wife to death. The selection was always varied and plentiful. It seemed there wasn't a person she couldn't find, only situations I couldn't imagine. It had been more than a month since her last matchmaking effort. I wondered who Zhang Chuxue had painstakingly selected this time to humiliate me. I took the photo my mom handed me, a man in his 30s, with thick eyebrows, large eyes, and prominent cheekbones. His features were more proper than any of the other men Zhang Chuxue had ever introduced, but he was suspiciously bald. Western restaurant. I checked my watch. 15 minutes had passed. I figured I had a good excuse to leave, and just as I was about to get up, the chair across from me was pulled out. A man in a crisp suit sat down. We glanced at each other, and the man looked more surprised than I was. After a few seconds, he smiled, casually taking off his jacket and hanging it on the chair behind him, his movements both relaxed and elegant. "Sorry, I got held up," he said, smiling as he sized me up. "You don't look like how the matchmaker described. You're much prettier." His confidence was perfectly balanced between self-assured and arrogant. He spoke directly, but not off-puttingly, exuding the charm of a refined elite. I was certain he wasn't bald, and he wasn't the man in the photo. He extended a well-manicured hand and politely introduced himself. "My name is Su Shiliang. I'm a friend of Zhuang Chongxi, and I used to be his lawyer." As expected, Zhang Chuxue, true to form, hadn't introduced me to anything worthwhile. Zhuang Chongxi was a wealthy second-generation heir who had injured someone in a drunk driving incident a year ago. He'd been out for only half a month and had already gone on a dozen blind dates. A woman with my qualifications would only add another tally to his matchmaking record. But Zhang Chuxue hadn't anticipated that in her eagerness to sabotage and humiliate me, she'd overdone it, to the point where the guy couldn't even be bothered to show up himself. Instead, he'd sent a well-rounded, handsome man in his place, one who, by a twist of fate, caught my eye. I extended my hand to Su Shiliang. "Chun Shi." His palm was slightly damp, with a warmth that was hard to resist. After the blind date, Su Shiliang and I exchanged numbers. We met a few more times for dinner and saw a couple of movies together. Gradually, I realized that not only was Su Shiliang incredibly handsome, but he was also courteous, gentlemanly, and considerate. He would pick me up and drop me off from work every day, surprise me with gifts from time to time, and not only make others envious, but even make me feel a bit overwhelmed. A man of such high quality is a rarity. His conditions were so impeccable that it often felt unreal. Moreover, I had 2 pairs of eyes watching me closely, so I couldn't afford to let my guard down. Sure enough, when Zhang Chuxue heard that things were going well for me, she couldn't sit still. Taking advantage of the fact that I was at work, she dragged my mom to Su Shiliang's law firm, pretending to be an old lady seeking legal assistance. They peppered him with personal questions for half the morning. Just before lunch, my mom excitedly called to report the results. "Cici, this Su Shiliang, this boy." My mom took several deep breaths, her voice almost choking with emotion. "Your aunt this time. She's sincere." "Really?" My ears tuned out my mom's voice, and as if guided by a higher power, I heard Zhang Chushua's sycophantic voice amidst the chatter. "Xiao Su, do you have a girlfriend? Would you like me to introduce you to someone?" My daughter, her figure, her looks, absolutely flawless. I hung up the phone, silently reciting the words my mom had taught me since I was little, reminding myself not to act impulsively. What isn't yours, don't fight for. What is yours, no one can take away. In the afternoon, Su Shirliang called and invited me to dinner. By the time I finished work, it had started raining. As I stepped out of the office, I noticed a group of colleagues gathered at the entrance, seemingly curious about something. A quick glance revealed Su Shirliang, tall and handsome, standing in front of his sleek car with a gentle smile. He was so tall, so handsome, and the car was so luxurious. As I got into the car, I could hear the whispers behind me. My vanity was instantly satisfied like never before. But that vanity lasted only a few fleeting seconds before it was quickly replaced by a familiar unease. As the car slowly pulled away, I saw a woman standing on the steps. Her slender figure and determined gaze were all too familiar to me. I took a deep breath, silently repeating to myself, "What isn't mine, I won't fight for. What is mine, no one can take away." After parking the car, Su Shirliang and I walked side by side along the wide street, my body tense as I deliberately kept some distance from him. A car drove past us, and Su Shirliang naturally pulled me into his arms. He leaned down to look at me, his eyes sparkling. As the car moved away, I quickly stepped out of his embrace, unsure of where to look. Su Shirliang noticed my discomfort and skillfully changed the topic. Su Shirliang smiled at me and said, "Qinshi, two strange ladies came to my office today. I think it might have something to do with you." He may have started with just a suspicion, but being harassed by two unfamiliar ladies for several hours, with them persistently asking personal questions, a smart man like him needed only a few subtle probes in his answers to figure out the truth. I didn't know what to say, only that I felt so ashamed I wanted to disappear. As a lawyer, Su Shirliang was impeccable in dealing with people, but he never used too many tactics with me. He always spoke with a childlike honesty. I didn't know if he had done his homework, but his approach certainly made me feel more at ease, and it made me even less willing to say those insincere, grandiose words. "I'm sorry, my mom, Su Shirliang interrupted me. "Don't worry." I answered very well. I said I already have a girlfriend, and she's very cute. His expression was relaxed, like a student who had just passed a minor test, with a small sense of pride and relief. He squeezed my hand a little tighter. I felt a lump in my throat, as if something in my chest was slowly melting, but I still kept my guard up, patiently waiting for the inevitable attack from behind. "Jie." Jiangwan slapped my shoulder, her eyes full of surprise. Years of experience had made her acting flawless, with most people unable to spot a single flaw. I turned around, ignoring the box of pastries she was holding, ready to watch her continue her uninspired performance. "Jie, what a coincidence. I was just craving some peach pastries, so I took a detour to buy some, and look, here you are." Jiangwan naturally linked arms with me, forcibly separating me from Su Shirliang. It was as if she didn't see the man, yet she still threw a few probing glances his way. Su Shirliang glanced at me, slowed his pace, and quietly followed behind. "Jie, remember those beads you brought me from Yunnan? One of my coworkers really liked them. I told them you gave them to me, and I also mentioned how you've always given me the best things since we were kids. They didn't believe me and said, 'Where can you find such a generous sister?'" Jiangwan chatted on as she guided me forward. I sneaked a look at Su Shirliang and saw his gaze fixed on Jiangwan's smooth, slender legs. My heart sank. They were so envious, saying they wished they had such a generous sister too. I automatically filtered out Jiangwan's words, waiting for her next move. Sure enough, just as we were about to reach the restaurant we had booked, Jiangwan suddenly stumbled on the steps, letting out a sharp ah as half her body tumbled to the ground, one leg bending at an angle that would be difficult for most people to achieve. At the same time, tears welled up in her eyes, her expression so helpless that even I, who knew every detail and stage of this routine, couldn't help but feel a pang of sympathy. Her acting just keeps improving. As Jiangwan had hoped, Su Shiliang rushed to her side almost immediately upon hearing her cry out, concern etched on his face as he asked, "Are you hurt badly?" While he crouched down to check her ankle, Jiang Wan winked at me. I knew that look. It meant she was confident of her victory. In the past, I couldn't understand how Jiang Wan's crude and obvious tricks could fool one boyfriend after another, whether they were academic stars, student council presidents, or rising professionals. But now I get it. The tricks are always the same, but some women naturally possess an aura that lowers a man's defenses. No matter how simple the ploy, when it's used by someone like her, it feels natural and men either can't see through it or simply choose not to. She's twisted her ankle. She needs to go to the hospital, Su Shiliang said after his examination, looking up at me. But it wasn't as though he was asking for my consent. I watched coldly as he picked up the whimpering Jiang Wan and started waving down the passing taxis, feeling a sharp, uncontrollable pang in my heart. To make things worse, it started to drizzle, the fine rain ruining the carefully styled bangs I had spent 20 minutes curling before leaving work. I forced down the pain, silently repeating my mantra over and over. What isn't mine, I won't fight for. What is mine, no one can take away. But even so, I could taste the salty bitterness on my face. I had lost again, and this time, it was an ugly defeat. Wiping the unidentified moisture from my face, I composed myself and prepared to leave. But suddenly, I felt the rain above me stop. Looking up, I was met with Su Shiliang's awkward expression as he held his suit jacket over my head. This was the first time he had seen me cry. "Let's get in the car and take her to the hospital," Su Shiliang said, his gaze probing as if he wanted to see through everything on my face. I turned my head towards Jiang Wan, who was sitting alone in the taxi not far away, her expression dark and venomous, as if she could squeeze ink from her glare. The sudden turn of events left me unprepared for victory. I nodded. At the hospital, I called Zhang Chuxue, and amidst the chaos, Su Shiliang took the opportunity to whisk me away. Dinner was 2 hours late, but it finally happened. As always, Su Shiliang was the perfect gentleman, pulling out my chair, asking about my preferences, and recommending dishes he thought I might like. Maybe it was because I was hungry, or perhaps it was the rare small victory I had just won, but I was in high spirits. I ate with great appetite and even ordered a drink with alcohol to sip on. As we finished our meal, Su Shiliang peeled a large lobster and placed it in my bowl. Then, as if it were nothing, he asked me, "Does your sister always act like this?" My mind went blank for a moment, unsure of his intentions. If he had seen through Jiang Wan's little schemes, would he also think I was equally manipulative? Su Shiliang continued peeling the lobster, his eyes downcast, his voice calm. "Her technique is good, but that fall was real. I'd say she'll be bedridden for 3 to 5 days. He looked up then, his eyes full of tenderness as he stared straight at me. "Qinshi, I imagine you haven't had it easy all these years." Could he really see through everything with just one look? I was stunned, then turned my face away, my eyes stinging as I dared not meet his gaze. To give me a sense of security, Su Shiliang and I publicly displayed our affection several times near the company. One of those times, he arranged hundreds of candles in the shape of a giant heart downstairs, his tall and handsome figure earning me envious, jealous, and admiring looks from the passers-by. Honestly, I was touched, but I still couldn't relax because I knew Jiang Wan wouldn't give up so easily with her personality. The morning after Jiang Wan twisted her ankle, the unstoppable Zhang Chuxue stormed into my house. For the first time in her life, she didn't go straight to rummage through my mom's closet or jewelry box. Instead, she charged directly into my room. She stood there with her hands on her hips, her beautiful phoenix eyes wide with anger, looking as though she might explode. "Qinshi, what kind of sister are you? How could you leave your injured sister alone in the hospital?" I looked up at her and asked, "So, what? Should I have my boyfriend stay with her?" Perhaps not expecting me to talk back, Zhang Chuxue was momentarily stunned, then grew even angrier. "What's wrong with letting him take her? Didn't I introduce Xiaosu to you? Without me, do you think you could find such a good man?" I replied, Yes, Auntie, you're so kind to me, always introducing millionaires or wealthy men to me, even the occasional ex-convict. Zhang Chuxue was speechless, her face turning blue and purple. I was also shocked by my sudden sharp tongue. While I was still in shock, Zhang Chuxue had already recovered and began wailing loudly, flailing her arms as she rushed toward my mom, who was brushing her teeth. Oh my, how did I end up so miserable? My dear sister, look at the daughter you raised. How can she bully us like this? We're so unfortunate. I shouldn't have had one at all. Why did I give birth to her? Just to suffer, just to be bullied. Zhang Chuxue sat on the sofa, wailing with tears and snot, stealing glances at my mom. As she wished, my mom's face paled, and her hand holding the toothbrush trembled uncontrollably. She, as her sister, you should go check on your sister later. A surge of heat rolled in my throat, and in the end, I chose to comply. Su Shiliang and I went to the hospital with fruits and a flower basket, and Jiangwan was overjoyed. I pretended that the air in the ward wasn't good, stepping out into the hallway to give Jiangwan plenty of room to work her magic. I didn't know what happened inside, but Jiangwan laughed heartily, her bell-like laughter piercing my eardrums and echoing down the hallway repeatedly, as if it would never stop. After a while, Su Shiliang came out. He looked at me, his lips moving as if to say something, but in the end, he said nothing. After our visit to the hospital, Jiangwan's ankle healed quickly, and she was discharged within a few days. Although Su Shiliang still occasionally asked me out for meals, I could sense that some sort of rift had formed between us. One day, he came to my company for lunch. We had just placed our order when Jiangwan walked in. Seeing us, she looked surprised, covering her mouth as she said, "Sister, what a coincidence." Then, in a shy, soft voice, she addressed Su Shiliang, "Mr. Su." Even though we were clearly having a meal together, she deliberately separated our names as if she had no idea about our relationship. "Mind if I join you?" Jiangwan asked cheerfully, as if meeting old friends. Su Shiliang glanced at me, and seeing no reaction, he turned to her with a bright smile and said, "Not convenient." Not convenient. Jiangwan, who was about to sit down, froze, her behind hovering awkwardly in midair. I stared in disbelief at the usually gentlemanly Su Shiliang. My heart exploded with joy, like popcorn popping. It was so sweet, so satisfying. I turned my head to suppress my emotions, trying to avoid laughing out loud in schadenfreude, but I could still feel Su Shiliang's probing gaze burning into me, making my ears turn red. Sister, Jiangwan, who had been ignored for a while, turned her teary eyes to me, looking pitiful but actually hiding a threat. I calmed down and, using a tone even I found disgusting, said, "Shiliang is just joking with you. Go ahead and sit." The smile on Su Shiliang's face faded. After dinner, it began to drizzle again. Standing at the restaurant entrance, Jiangwan held her bag over her head and said coyly to Su Shiliang, "Mr. Su, I remember it was raining like this the first time we met." Su Shiliang chuckled. "Yes, it seems we're fated. But today I drove, so I can give you ladies a ride." Both Jiangwan and I were momentarily stunned, each with our own thoughts as we waited for him to bring the car around. "Ladies, please get in." Su Shiliang opened the car door and made a gesture for us to enter. Just as I was about to step forward, Jiangwan, in her 8-centimeter heels, quickly slid into the front passenger seat with a shy smile. Su Shiliang straightened up, glanced at me, and opened the back door for me. The comfortable SUV glided smoothly along the road as I leaned back against the soft cushion, listening to Jiangwan and Su Shiliang exchange playful banter. My mood sank to its lowest point. We were nearing the fork in the road, where Jiangwan and I would part ways. Who would Su Shiliang choose to drop off first? No, it wasn't about who would be dropped off first, but rather who would be dropped off at all. Just before the intersection, at a traffic light, Jiangwan suddenly clutched her ankle, the pain from her injury seemingly returning. She placed one hand on her ankle and the other on Su Shiliang's hand as he drove, her expression full of pain. Su Shiliang glanced down at her ankle and said in a deep voice, Maybe I should take you to the hospital first. Jiangwan shook her head. No need. I'll be fine after resting at home. The intersection where my sister and I part ways is just ahead. You can drop me off there. If she couldn't move forward, she might as well retreat. Since she put it that way, if Su Shiliang still left her on the roadside, it wouldn't just be a question of gentlemanliness. I silently applauded her cunning. Su Shiliang looked at me as if expecting me to say something, but for some reason, even though I wanted to say, I'll go with you to drop her off, what came out instead was, Shiliang, you should drop my sister off first. I'll take a cab home. Su Shiliang was taken aback, but did as I suggested, letting me out of the car. The rain had intensified, and only then did I realize I had hurried out without taking an umbrella. The intersection was chaotic, the dim streetlights casting a yellow glow on my desolate face as cars sped past me, splashing cold, painful water onto my cheeks. At that moment, it struck me, so much of my life, filled with competition, snatching, and being taken from, was my own doing. I never fought, never contended, never took action, never resisted, always waiting passively for someone to save me. But who was obligated to save me? And even if someone did come to save me, would I, trapped in the mire, still reach out my hand? As the blaring horns echoed all around, I finally couldn't hold back my tears any longer. Chunshi. A car pulled up beside me, and a familiar figure got out. It was Su Shiliang. For the first time, Su Shiliang rather roughly shoved me into the passenger seat. Through my tear-blurred vision, I noticed Jiangwan was nowhere to be seen. We drove to a secluded area on the outskirts of the city, and the car finally stopped. Su Shiliang turned off the engine, looked at my tear-streaked face, and, in a mix of anger and amusement, said, "It's just an umbrella. Why are you crying?" I didn't answer, trying hard to suppress my sobs. Su Shiliang smiled as he wiped my tears away with his hand, his warm breath brushing against my neck, making me forget to breathe. I've been a lawyer for 7 or 8 years now. Over the years, I've seen too many couples fighting over money, brothers turning against each other, fathers and sons becoming enemies. It made me believe that everyone in this world is fighting, competing, that everywhere is filled with desire. So when I first saw your serene and indifferent demeanor, I was instantly captivated. Like a sudden clap of thunder, his unexpected confession shocked me into silence. Unfortunately, I wasn't who he thought I was. I wasn't naturally magnanimous, nor was I devoid of desire. I was just weak. As expected, Su Shiliang's tone shifted. But as I got to know you, I realized you're not really like that. Beneath your calm exterior lies a dormant volcano, long silent, waiting to erupt. What's strange is, this discovery didn't disappoint me. Instead, it surprised and fascinated me. Of course. Su Shiliang looked at me and said, "More than anything, it made me feel for you." I was stunned, unable to react, when suddenly Su Shiliang cupped my face in his hands. In the shimmering light of his eyes, I saw my own panicked reflection. He said, "Chunshi, from today on, accept me. You don't need to worry about being taken away. I'll always be here waiting for you." I wasn't always like this. When I was young, if something I loved was taken from me, I would cry and make a fuss. My wise mother would gently comfort me, saying, "Shishi, be good. Mommy will buy you a new one later." But gradually, her comforting words turned into dismissive platitudes. "You're the older sister. What's wrong with giving a few things to your sister?" I especially remember the time with the bicycle. I cried so hard. I had waited for 6 months, studied diligently every day, and finally, after countless top scores, my mom agreed to buy me a little bike. But before I could even tear off the packaging, it was taken from me. My mother, tired of giving me empty promises, replaced them with anger and scolding. "Serves you right for showing it off. No wonder it got taken from you." So, to avoid the pain of losing, I chose not to own anything at all, letting her take whatever she wanted. I once thought that the fire inside me had died forever, but Su Shiliang made me consider changing for the first time. That day, Su Shiliang drove only a short distance before calling a friend to take Jiangwan home. He leisurely returned to pick me up, leaving Jiang Wan and her mother fuming. We enjoyed a period of peace, which lasted until a month later when I was assigned a business trip by the company. Jiang Wan's name was added to the trip at the last minute, so when we arrived at the hotel and found there weren't enough rooms, as the only women on the team, I had no choice but to share a room with her. After dinner, back at the hotel, Su Shiliang texted me, saying he wanted to video chat. I glanced at Jiang Wan lying on the bed and, against my better judgment, agreed. "Are you tired today?" Su Shiliang had just washed his hair. The tips were still damp. He was wearing a V-neck loungewear, and his slightly flushed skin extended from his neck downwards. I couldn't help but blush and said, "Not too bad, just." I glanced behind me and continued, "In a couple of days, I might get really busy, so I may not have time to contact you." "It's okay. Just take care of yourself while you're out." Su Shiliang reminded me of a few things to be mindful of, and I responded with a few simple remarks. Before I knew it, we had talked for over 10 minutes. Yes, the seaside scenery is nice, but it's windy this time of year. Make sure to eat more, so you don't get blown away, Su Shiliang was saying, when suddenly, his expression turned cold, and he abruptly ended the video call. We were having such a pleasant conversation. What happened? Just then, my phone buzzed with a new message. It was from Su Shiliang, and it was brief. He wrote, "Look behind you." I turned around and saw Jiang Wan, who should have been in the bathroom, walking around the living room completely naked. I felt something inside me crack open, emotions that had been building up finally ready to erupt. "Jiang Wan." I slammed my laptop shut and demanded, "What are you doing?" Jiang Wan looked up at me with a face full of innocence. "What's wrong, sis?" "I'm just looking for my toiletries." I slapped Jiang Wan hard across the face, finally saying what I had wanted to for years. "You think I don't know what you're up to? Shameless." Jiang Wan turned her head back, the innocence gone from her expression. She looked at me in disbelief, then spat out angrily. "Qin Shi, you think I don't know what you're up to? You finally found a man who won't be taken from you, so you video chatted in front of me to show off." She sneered from her high horse, "But let me tell you, anything of yours, if I want it, I'll take it. There's nothing I can't get." Jiang Wan threw on her coat, grabbed her suitcase, and left. The veil that had hung between us for over a decade was finally torn down by me. Strangely enough, I felt an unprecedented sense of relief. A week later, after returning from my business trip, I arranged for my parents to meet Su Shiliang for the first time. Just as we were getting dressed and preparing to leave, Zhang Chuxue burst in. "Oh, sister and brother-in-law, where is your happy family off to?" As soon as Zhang Chuxue entered with her swaying hips, my parents, who had been so cheerful, instantly turned gloomy. My mother set down her bag as if she had done something wrong and hunched over as she went into the kitchen. "Chuxue, why are you here in this cold weather? Let me get you a cup of tea." "No need, sister." Zhang Chuxue lengthened her face. My father, sensing that we would not be leaving that day, walked into the bedroom and started smoking. Zhang Chuxue placed her hands on her hips and scrutinized me from head to toe before finally speaking. "Such happy events make one so cheerful. But Shi, I need to discuss something with you." Zhang Chuxue changed her expression to a smile as she looked at me. "Last time, I introduced Su to you without realizing the full story. I later found out that he was actually your sister's first love. Wanwan has always had feelings for him. Just look at it this way. Your relationship with Su isn't that deep. So how about?" Zhang Chuxue started to dab at her eyes with her sleeve, pretending to cry. "Wanwan's life has been so tough. She hasn't been eating or drinking properly these days. How can she withstand this? Don't worry, after you break up with Su, I'll introduce you to someone thousands of times better." I couldn't believe the shamelessness of these two. No way. My parents were also stunned. They knew what Jiang Wan had done to me over the years, but at least they used to put on a facade. Now, they were blatantly demanding. I was resolute and gave Zhang Chuxue only 3 words. "No, absolutely not." As if completely caught off guard, Zhang Chuxue stared at me for a while before turning to my mother with a sneer. "Sister, how can you have such a selfish daughter? If it wasn't for what happened in your home back then, how would I have ended up pregnant with Yuan before marriage and forced to marry a poor countryman? Sister, your guest raped me and ruined my life, and now your daughter is going to ruin my daughter's life. Finally, the truth was out. My poor mother, overwhelmed by Zhang Chushua's relentless accusations, collapsed onto the floor. My father, who had arrived at the commotion, looked at her with such pain that he seemed to age decades in an instant. I had long suspected that my parents' tolerance of Zhang Chushua and her daughter was rooted in more than just familial duty, but I never imagined it was driven by such deep-seated guilt and helplessness. At that time, I was 2 years old. My parents were at the forefront of the times, socially active, young, and fun-loving. On my mother's birthday, they sent me to my grandmother's house and held a wild party at home. My father had just started his career as a police officer, known for his sense of justice, and had befriended many reformed criminals. That night, Zhang Chushua was also there. The group ate, drank, and had fun until late into the night, and in the darkness, a tragedy occurred. 20-year-old Zhang Chushua was raped, and the perpetrator fled overnight. Zhang Chushua attempted suicide several times, but survived. Eventually, she ended up marrying a simple man from the countryside, heavily pregnant, arranged by my parents. A few years ago, she urged her husband to work in mining, but he died in a mining accident. Zhang Chushua received a compensation payout of hundreds of thousands, which she squandered over a few years. Afterwards, she had ambiguous relationships with several men in the neighborhood and was threatened and beaten by their wives and relatives several times. In recent years, Zhang Chushua's life has been full of misfortunes. Perhaps she would rather suffer herself than let my parents find peace. Zhang Chushua didn't expect that once the unspeakable secret was revealed, it would lose its original power. That day, I watched my father help my mother up from the floor, carefully tie her shoelaces, and then, as if he didn't see the agitated Zhang Chushua, he walked out the door. He said, "Cece, let's go. We're late." After decades as a police officer, burdened with guilt over an unsolved case that never allowed him to stand upright at home, I looked at his back, and all the grievances I had suffered over the years seemed to dissipate. After meeting with Su Shiliang, my parents were very satisfied and both parties began discussing the next steps. Unexpectedly, a significant episode occurred just as things were settling down. That day, Zhang Chushua suddenly had a change of heart and invited me, my parents, and Su Shiliang to a restaurant for dinner. At the table, she cried bitterly, constantly confessing to us and reminiscing about the sisterly bond from years ago, hugging my mother as they both wept. A repentant sinner is worth more than gold, and Zhang Chushua admitted her wrongs and promised not to interfere with my relationship with Su Shiliang. But I, ever sensitive, still sensed something was off. Jiangwan didn't come. I checked my phone. Su Shiliang hadn't replied to my texts for several hours, which was unusual. My father and I exchanged a worried glance and stepped out of the private room to call Su Shiliang. The phone was turned off. Suddenly, my heart sank, and a very unsettling feeling surged in my chest. Returning to the private room, I asked Zhang Chushua calmly, "Auntie, why didn't Yuan come today?" Zhang Chushua, whose acting skills were no match for Jiangwan's, hesitated for a moment before laughing and saying, "Oh, she's working overtime today and couldn't make it." My heart grew cold. Our company is busy and overtime is common for most departments, but Jiangwan's administrative department is usually very relaxed. Overtime is rare except around the New Year. Realizing this, my heart began to race, and the unsettling feeling in my chest intensified. Was there something Zhang Chushua and her daughter still shouldn't do? With my father's help, I shook off Zhang Chushua and anxiously searched for Su Shiliang. I called his friends and colleagues one by one, but no one knew where he was. Time was running out. I remembered that although Zhang Chushua had obstructed me, she hadn't done so with all her might. Whatever Jiangwan was planning, she likely had already succeeded. But Su Shiliang would definitely have precautions. What kind of method and where would it be to make him let his guard down? A thought suddenly cleared my foggy mind. I hurriedly hailed a taxi and told the driver to rush back to my house. The door was closed, just like when we left, but my intuition told me something was different. I hesitated for a moment, then, trembling, unlocked the door. As soon as it opened, Su Shiliang, disheveled and tattered, rushed out from inside. Seeing me, the tense muscles in his body relaxed a little. "You're here." Su Shiliang smiled faintly, and his tall frame nearly knocked me over as he fell against me. In my living room, Jiangwan knelt half-naked on the sofa. There was no shame from being caught, only a sense of defeat and despair from the inevitable outcome. I knew that in this day and age, she wouldn't expect to break us apart by sleeping with Su Shiliang just once. But she understood my temperament well. Once they had a relationship, there would be an insurmountable barrier in my heart. If she couldn't have it, she would find a way to make me suffer for the rest of my life. What she didn't expect was Su Shiliang's strong self-control. Despite the potent aphrodisiac, he managed to escape. A few minutes later, my parents and Zhang Chuxue arrived at the scene. Seeing Jiangwan on the sofa with a vacant expression, Zhang Chuxue screamed and rushed over, crying uncontrollably. I supported the dazed Su Shiliang and looked at my father with red eyes. "Dad, I beg you, let us leave." "Dad, I know it's selfish of me, but I really don't want to be a victim to repay your guilt." My father swallowed hard, tossed me the car keys, and said, "Let's go." At Su Shiliang's apartment, I struggled to get him onto the bed. Just as I was about to breathe a sigh of relief, he suddenly pulled me into his arms. I noticed his body was flushed red, his shirt was torn in several places, and there was a scratch mark on his chest. I touched his red face, gently tracing his handsome features, his delicate features, and soft lips. "Thirsty, water." Su Shiliang's eyes were closed, as if he had no strength left. "Okay, I'll get it now." But as I turned around, someone grabbed my hand. Glancing unintentionally at his muscular chest, I blushed and whispered, "If you let go, I can get you some water." Su Shiliang shook his head with a faint smile, then swiftly pressed the back of my head, and his soft lips met mine firmly. "This way, you won't be thirsty." Under the effect of the drug, Su Shiliang's face was flushed, his voice soft and soothing, sending tingles through my body. Before I could react, Su Shiliang held the back of my head again, pressing his lips to mine. My mind exploded in a haze, unable to think clearly. Just as things were getting intense, Su Shiliang seemed to suddenly regain clarity. He opened his eyes wide, looking at me as if trying to peer into the depths of my soul. He asked, "Cici, our first time is under these circumstances. Are you willing?" I looked at him and nodded deeply. A few days later, Dad called and asked me to come home. Su Shiliang was originally going to come with me, but I declined, saying, "I need to resolve my own issues myself." Su Shiliang was silent for a moment before smiling and nodding. When I returned home, Zhang Chuxue was indeed there. Seeing me, she suddenly lunged at me like a starving wolf, grabbing me and crying uncontrollably. "Cici, please save Wanwan. It was Auntie's fault before, it was Wanwan's fault, but she was just joking around before. This time it's different. Wanwan is truly sincere. Without Su Shiliang, Wanwan really can't go on." Zhang Chuxue wasn't entirely lying. Su Shiliang was indeed Jiangwan's secret crush. Her father's compensation case from the mining accident was helped by Su Shiliang. Originally, a life was worth 20,000 in private settlement, but Su Shiliang managed to force the opponent to raise it to 300,000 in court with just a few words. Unfortunately, at that time, Su Shiliang was neither wealthy nor influential, and he wasn't my boyfriend. Jiangwan, who had suitors flocking to her, never cared for him. Yet now, everything had changed upon their reunion. But I understood her. It wasn't so much the pain of unrequited love as it was the unwillingness to accept her first failure. Zhang Chuxue said that, up to now, Jiangwan had been fasting for half a month, attempted suicide by hanging twice, and cut her wrist 7 times, spending half of her time in the hospital. I freed myself from Zhang Chuxue's grasp and calmly said, "Auntie, since Wanwan is heartbroken right now, you should spend more time with her." Zhang Chuxue was taken aback, then stumbled back into the living room, knocking over the coffee table with a crash, sending cups and dishes shattering all over the floor. Seeing the glass shards on the floor, Zhang Chuxue's eyes showed madness. Before I could stop her, she picked up a shard, trembling, and pressed it against her own throat. Facing my parents, she screamed, "Sister, brother-in-law, you have such cruel hearts, ruining my life and now trying to harm my daughter. If you're going to be so ruthless, why don't you just take my life?" Mom was terrified and hurried forward to persuade her. "Swear, don't be impulsive. Let's discuss this further. Let's discuss this further." Mom looked at me for help. Her eyes were filled with guilt, but she had already made a decision. I felt a chill all over, and all my strength was concentrated in my voice as I said 3 words: "Impossible." Upon hearing this, Zhang Chuxue seemed to get a signal and raised the shard in her hand. Mom immediately rushed to grab it, but Zhang Chuxue refused to let go. During their struggle, Mom was cut on the forehead by the glass shard, and blood flowed profusely. Zhang Chuxue, Dad, who had been smoking nearby, dropped his cigarette and rushed over to check Mom's wound. Fortunately, although the blood flow was heavy, the cut was not deep. For over a decade, Dad, burdened with guilt, had never raised his voice at Zhang Chuxue. This was the first time he yelled at her, leaving Zhang Chuxue stunned. "Zhang Chuxue, don't think that just because you don't speak of it, no one will ever know what you've done." Dad pulled out a stack of files from the studies cabinet and slammed them on the table. "The police department has just solved a new robbery case. Guess who the culprits are?" Mom, holding her forehead, looked at Dad with suspicion, then at Zhang Chuxue. Zhang Chuxue stared at the files on the table, 3 men with ordinary faces, yet they horrified her. That's right, these are the 3 men who raped you years ago. But Zhang Chuxue, you know better than anyone whether it was truly rape. The case had been resolved for a week, and the files were ready. If it weren't for Zhang Chuxue's threats, Dad might have kept this hidden for a while longer. At the party years ago, Zhang Chuxue indeed had relations with the 3 men, but they did not force her. It was consensual. In reality, she had consumed a potent aphrodisiac, which made her act beyond her control. But where did this aphrodisiac come from? Why did Zhang Chuxue take it herself? Dad lit a cigarette and continued. At the party, Zhang Chuxue had a low tolerance for alcohol and had been drinking fruit wine. Some guests, however, mischievously mixed strong liquor into her drink. Mom, knowing that Dad could drink endlessly, switched their glasses when she had the chance, a detail Dad was aware of. Initially, Dad had only vague suspicions, but after seeing Jianwan's methods, he pieced everything together. Fortunately, after the tragedy, Dad and Mom had been too distraught to clean up properly, and the tableware had been left untouched in the storage room. He had asked a colleague from the forensic department to help, and after several days of work, they finally found traces of the drug on one of the glasses, along with half a lipstick mark and 2 sets of fingerprints, Dad's and Zhang Chuxue's. Shue, Mom's pupils dilated suddenly, and she collapsed to the floor, as if all strength had left her. "Is it really that glass of wine?" Mom looked at Dad, hoping for a denial, but Dad's expression revealed that the truth she had tried so hard to protect was so unspeakable. With the evidence undeniable, Zhang Chuxue could no longer argue, and in an instant, she fell into despair. Kneeling on the floor, she crawled over and grabbed Mom's sleeve. "Sister, I was wrong. Please forgive me this once. I made a mistake." Mom seemed to have lost all hope, her eyes devoid of emotion. "Leave. Don't come back." After Zhang Chuxue left, Su Shiliang called me. "Is it over?" I nodded and answered briefly, "Yes. My Sisi is wonderful." Su Shiliang chuckled on the other end of the line. "I was planning to come over and propose to you after you were done, but now there's a small issue, so it'll take a bit more time." "Yeah, your cousin ran into some trouble." He casually mentioned, "Don't worry, remember my profession. She won't come out on top." I smiled and hung up the phone. In the living room, Dad was tending to Mom's wound, their faces filled with tears and mutual affection. After a long time, Mom looked at me with eyes full of guilt. "Cece, I want to buy you a bicycle of your own." Recalling the past, tears welled up in my eyes. "No need, Mom. I already have something she can never take away from me."